Hello, I'm Dr. Robert LaBelle, and today we're going to be covering lower cross syndrome. Lower cross syndrome is it's a theory of how we distribute our weight in our abdomen and in our low back. All humans, as time goes on, develop a predictable pattern of tightness to certain muscles in the low back and the hip, and subsequently their antagonist muscles or their opposing muscles develop weakness. Ariana is standing quite tall here, and what we can see, if you can raise your arms, you can see that her abdomen is nice and in, her hip is flexed into a good position, and her back isn't horribly arched by any means. If you can go into the lower cross syndrome, Ariana, what ends up happening in the lower cross syndrome is due to weakness from sitting all day long. We don't do our appropriate core stabilization work or our ab work. What ends up happening is the abs start to protrude out, and as they protrude out, the low back starts to arch onto itself. And as it arches onto itself, the low back muscles become tight, and so do the low back joints. As well, what ends up happening is you get quite a bit of hip flexor tension in the front of your or lower portion of your groin or lower abdomen. As well, in the lower cross syndrome, we very often will see considerable glute weakness. Now, that doesn't mean that the glutes or the hip isn't tight to stretch. It means that it's inhibited. When the person's standing, they typically don't use the glute musculature to hold their body weight up against gravity. They just lock their back into tension into here. Ariana, if you can go into a unilateral pose. As well with the lower cross syndrome, what I see very often, or what we see in CCSR, is this one-sided loading pattern that makes the lower cross syndrome considerably worse. Before, she was loading into her low back, making the muscles tight and as well the joints, but now she's actually bared all of her weight onto one side, making the lumbar muscles on the left and the left hip really, really tight. They're bearing a considerable amount of the load. On the opposite side, this entire right leg is not contracting whatsoever, so the glute becomes highly inhibited, and so the hamstrings on both sides will, as time goes on, overreact to that inhibition. Come up for me. In addressing lower cross syndrome, it's about teaching the patient how to hold their weight up against gravity. As Ariana is doing wonderfully here, she's distributing her weight equally between both feet, and she has a good tuck to her lower abdomen, and she has a mild contraction to her glutes, which basically helps hold you up. If those tissues aren't contracting, then she would be forced to use the opposing muscles, and that's what we're trying to avoid with lower cross syndrome.